Mohammed.
Go into it. In your own words, and could you tell us a summarized version of what took place in the north in relation to the Ka'an regime, the military regime, versus those that took up arms like the Somali National Movement, for example? So focusing on still on the north and not the south, Haidit forces and that sort of thing. So focusing on the SNM. So what happened? How did that armed struggle come about? And what was the consequence of that?
I think the major problems of Somalia started after the Somali army had been defeated in the Ogaden War, so 1978. Actually, when Somali forces had been defeated, this caused a lot of problems. Like, of course, the military was in shatters. There was a big loss of lives. There was a big loss of equipment. Siad Barre had been shaken. His power had been shaken, so to say. There was also, as you know, there were coup attempts inside Somalia. There was this attempt, I think, in April 1978, which was led mainly by Machaten officers, but also involved also others, which were all signs that things were kind of going into a new direction inside Somalia. And I think that would have been a beautiful moment for Mohammed Siad Barre to resign. He would have had to retire, exactly. He would probably have left quite a good legacy, like 10 years of rule, a lot of development in the 1970s, the introduction of the Somali script, the increase of the literacy in Somalia, some kind of development happening in the fishery sector, in the agricultural sector. Though it would have been a beautiful moment for him to retire and to say, okay, somebody else should do the job. However, this didn't happen, and he clung to power, and I think this was then also the period when clanism became a real problem in politics. It has been around before, but it has been not recognized. It has been also not officially endorsed, of course. But I think from 78, 79 onwards, the latest, Siad Barre took pains to kind of establish a very close group of supporters around him, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them have been in one way or the other related to I mean, they have been part of his family. And I think also, and honestly speaking, for me the reasons are not 100% clear. He started fighting against what he sensed as opposition with brutal means, and you know that actually the first operation of Somali forces against their own people happened in Mudug region, right? It happened in the area of Galkayo and the countryside, where after the coup attempt of the Machaten officers, he cracked down on their relatives in the area, which was the first sign that actually the justice was gone out of the window in Somalia. I mean, otherwise you would put people on trial, you would deal with these kind of issues in a legal way, but not by killing relatives of people you suspect as traitors. And I don't really know why Siad Barre resorted to this kind of brutal means, because as you know, in Somali culture, if you start killing your relatives, there will be revenge killings. So people will mobilize against you, and they will try everything in order to revenge, or to defend themselves and revenge. And I think this is pretty much what really happened also then in the late 1970s and early 1980s in this area. And the first movement, the Somali, not the SNM, but there was also the SSF, and which later became SSDF, led by Abdullahi Yusuf and others. This came about as the first armed opposition group against Siad Barre, and then it was very closely followed by the Somali National Movement, which was set up in 1981. And it also, I think, if you speak with people who have been involved in the setup of the Somali National Movement in the north, which was set up in the Arab Peninsula and in London, of course, and was then starting to fight in the north from Ethiopia. If you speak with people who have been involved, then they would always say, yeah, they felt this pressure. You know, Siad Barre was kind of singling them out, oppressing them. They didn't get any kind of high-profile jobs. They were not allowed to leave the country. They didn't get scholarships. Though they were kind of as a clan, they were kind of oppressed. I haven't been around in these days. I'm not 100% sure if this was really the case or not. However, there must have been a strong sentiment against Siad Barre also among those people. They set up the Somali National Movement. But initially, the Somali National Movement was a very small group of maybe, you know, let it be like 50 people, like 100 people, maybe 200 people. The majority of the people in the north was still more or less not ready for an armed struggle against the regime. However, and I think this was a tragic mistake of Mohamed Siad Barre, he continued to use force against any sign of opposition. And not everybody was completely against his rule, but people were kind of claiming more justice, more rights. You know, the UFO group in Hargeisa, the people that were actually civil rights, not civil rights activists, they were social workers, they were medical doctors, teachers, who actually realized that the north, let's say Hargeisa and Bur'o, have been completely marginalized when it comes to education, to healthcare, to development. And they said, we want to do something for our own people. So if Mogadishu doesn't do anything for us, we do it ourselves. I don't think that they had, not all of them had the kind of military agenda or political agenda, but Siad Barre kind of interpreted it like anything could be a challenge to his rule, and anything has to be met with brutal force. So he established his security courts, he established military rule in the area, he put curfews, or his military commanders then put curfews in the area. As you know, in the 1980s, you couldn't leave the house after 5 or after 6, which kind of kills social life, it kills economical life, it kills people's freedom.
It also stigmatizes and
it stigmatizes these people, you know. I mean, the first who have been stigmatized have been the Machete, and the second one who have been stigmatized have been the Isaac in the north. And in a way, you call for trouble if you do that, right? And this is exactly what happens. So more and more people couldn't bear these kind of oppression, which really became an obvious oppression. But I think even in 1985, 1986, the majority of the ordinary people in the north were not even ready to take up arms. What really happened when in May 1988, the SNM had to move out of Ethiopia because there was an agreement between Ethiopia and Somalia, between Mengistu Haile Mariam and between Mohamed Siad Barre, that they kind of would end their conflict. And part of this agreement was, as far as I remember, that they would also stop the mutual support of guerrilla movements. Somalia would not support guerrilla movements within Ethiopia anymore.
Like
Ethiopia, exactly, ONLF, or the Western Somali Liberation Front. And Ethiopia wouldn't support Somali guerrilla movements against Mogadishu anymore. And this was in the final decision where that the SNM actually had to leave Ethiopia and finally confront the Somali regime head on in the north and actually attack Hargeisa, Bur'o, and I think they also wanted to attack Berbera, but it didn't work out. So they attacked Hargeisa and Bur'o, and they occupied those cities to some degree, temporarily, some areas of the cities. And then again, a horribly wrong decision was to just area bombard those cities. You know, not kind of trying to negotiate, not trying to find any kind of other solution, but just kind of even making things worse and just kill anybody in these areas indiscriminately, which then finally in June and July 1988 led to a mass uprising in those areas. And at that moment, the SNM, the Somali National Movement, became like a real mass movement, which was then kind of having also the power to really challenge the military in the region, and eventually succeeded and took over northwestern Somalia in early 1991.
Okay, to come back on several points on what you mentioned earlier, what comes back to me from also holding similar opinion is that obviously these struggles happened due to the suppression of the regime, right? But initially it was not based his own self-advice. It was within his own tight circle group of people who said, look, this is what we need to do. We need to show strength. We need to show unity. And it even included certain elements of these tribes that basically hailed from these ends. And they've been, you know, provoked and asked again and again, look, if you were part of the Ka'an regime and you supported when this happened, why are you claiming this now as individuals, not as a state, but as individuals? And these sort of elements was always around Mohamed Siad Barre. And obviously as a figure, a person, a military regime or a leader who is trying to hold on to his seat, he had obviously close, tight circle of people who were actually obviously close to him through family, through marital family, and also through people who had their own self-interest in actually getting into that close, tight circle and benefiting from that. Have you come across anything in those sort of places?
No, I think that's a correct description. I think there has been, of course, Mohammed Ali Samatar, who was also a very prominent, a very powerful member of the Ka'an regime, and I think also you're correct that it's not all Siad Barre. That's absolutely true. I don't think that he personally is responsible for everything which has gone wrong in these days. I mean, he had people around him who sometimes pushed him into certain directions, or who proposed certain solutions which then eventually also really were enacted. And I think Mohammed Ali Samatar, he himself actually has admitted that he was for pushing Siad Barre in the direction of really bombarding or reacting with a strong force against the SNM when they occupied the parts of Hargeisa and Bur'o. Also, I think it's correct that when you say that individuals who come from clans in these areas where atrocities happen, they have been part of the Somali government until 1990 or 1991. I just would qualify a little bit. These, I don't think that these were the individuals who had a lot of power in their hands. I think that we all know that there have been prison commanders, for instance, who have been Isaac, who served the regime until the end, or there have been kind of medium-range military commanders. But I don't think that on the top level, these people were involved. I think on the top level, it was others who were involved. But you're right, there was some representation of these groups in the Somali government up until the end. You always have to question who held what kind of power. One thing is the official position, and one thing is the real power. Right, and I think Mohammed Ali Samatar, he had a very strong position, and he also really had power. But there's another guy, for instance, I think he was at one point a vice president. What is his name? Ismail. I think he was from the north, and he held he was at one point, I think, a vice president of Somalia. I don't think that he had very strong power at one point. I think he was also put to prison in the 1980s. Yeah. So anyway,
he was kind of appointed as a prime minister to sort of soothe and make the situation much more tolerable. And he failed in that, and obviously, short after that, he was sacked.
Exactly.
I can't remember correctly.
Yeah. And so I think the point I want to bring across is, one thing is the name the position you have, and the other thing is the real power you have.
The claims, as we know, the recent genocide claims against the Ka'an government and American court allotting multi-million to victims of, let's say, Samatar's sort of role that he took in terms of the what happened in Hargeisa, the bombardments and everything. Is that going to set some sort of a precedent for more clan cleansing claims, or as it were, genocide and counterclaims from various tribes? Then you would be looking at Aidid sort of handiwork, and then the Mahdi's handiwork, and then you would be looking at maybe Morgan's handiwork as well, in further down in Kismayo and all that area. And then you've got the Afgoye issues, and then you've got maybe even just before the Somali federal government came, the TFG and the Ethiopians. Then you've got the United Islamic Courts, because they're not free from that either. So there was key figures that actually played these roles and who are part of the Somali federal government today. So where would the buck stop?
No, you're right. There are so many problems with with these kind of atrocities which happen in Somalia. I mean, if you look at it historically, it's more than 30 years now that Somalia suffers from outrageous violence in many areas, or Somalis suffer from outrageous violence in many areas. So on the one hand, you could say, this case against Samatar may be setting a precedence in order to establish more claims and get more compensation. However, I think you have to distinguish again between what happened before 1991 and afterwards, because Samatar was actually held responsible as a representative of the Somali government, which was, you know, a legal and internationally recognized government with all the obligations as well. So they are obliged to respect basic human rights. They have been parties to all kinds of international legal treaties, to the Geneva Convention, and they acted not as warlords or as militia leaders, but they acted as head of state, as minister of defense, as prime ministers, you know it. So, and everywhere in the world, when government officials obviously violate basic human rights or basic international laws, then they may be held responsible. Not that they always are held responsible, but there is a possibility that they will be held responsible. And there is also, you know, you can direct the blame at this particular person, because you really know in a government, this person is in charge. It's not like whatever Ahmed, or it's not kind of Abdi, is the Minister of Defense is in charge of the military, or the head of the state, if he's the commander-in-chief, is responsible for what the military does. And this is a decisive difference between what happened from 1991 onwards, when basically the government was overthrown and people grabbed all the guns which have been reserved for the Somali army. People were armed, ordinary people became armed to their teeth, and people who previously had been business people or diplomats or kind of medium-range military officers became militia leaders, and they started to fight each other. I mean, the question of who is the leader, who has the clear command, also what is the training of those people, that is not the same like it was before 1991. Before 1991 you had clear structures, you had well-trained soldiers, you had clear mandates actually. So I think the Samatar case in this regard is relatively particular because it was not, I would say it was not really Mohammed Ali Samatar put on trial, it was like the previous Somali regime put on trial. And Samatar was just serving as the highest ranking representative of this regime alive. Siad Barre had died, as we all know, so I think he was the second highest person alive. So he was held responsible for actually his personal role, of course, in the bombardment of Hargeisa, but also it was like as a representative of this regime. So they succeeded. But it was, as you know, it was a civil claim. It was not a criminal case. So it was a civil case. He is liable to pay damages. Damages, I know, like 21 million have been awarded. But the question is, will ever be any money paid? I mean, he filed for bankruptcy. I don't know what the latest developments in this case are. But I think it was more like a symbolic victory than it was really about money. So, I mean, okay, so will there be more? Will this set a precedence for more, for more cases against representatives of the older regime? Yeah, I think so too. I think that this will, in a way, be a precedence. Not that it's followed immediately by more and more cases, but I think, yeah, it opened an avenue, and more people will probably be held accountable eventually. However, as you also know, the case happened in the US under US jurisdiction. And it was basically against Samatar, who was a US citizen by that time, or who is now a US citizen as far as I'm informed, and by other US citizens, Somali-born US citizens. So it was not really something which happened inside Somalia and was Somali-driven. Or in The Hague, yeah. But then even it would also be the Somali government who would eventually send people to The Hague. So I think it can set a precedence, but we still have to wait until Somalia probably will become more stable and the Somali government will actually be so sovereign that it deals with these issues in its own way, either inside Somalia or it refers people to The Hague. That's one thing. What happened after from 1991 onwards actually is a much more chaotic situation, and things have changed so many times. You know, perpetrators became victims, victims become perpetrators. There is actually no group, I would say, apart from a very few minority groups, which has not been involved in some kind of atrocities against others. And as you already in your question also mentioned, there were people wearing multiple hats. They have been militia leaders, they became religious leaders, they became government officials, they joined various groups, and And in all of these groups, they held different responsibilities and conducted different military operations or armed operations. So it's very complicated to sort these problems out. I personally think it would be very good that at one point Somalis sit down and discuss these problems, these atrocities, what really happened. I don't think that there will be kind of a legal solution for these problems, and from 1991 onwards, because they have been. It's very difficult to establish individual responsibility for these kind of atrocities. But I think this book by Litwin Kapteins, if you may. If you allow me to say a word on that, this clan cleansing book, because you used the term clan cleansing, and I mean she put it on the cover of her book as a title. I think there has been a lot of criticism of it, and there have been a lot of very emotional debates about how she's writing and whom she's defending, and like if she has her own clan bias and stuff like that. Be this as it may, I mean, no one in this world is able to write a complete objective account of anything, to be honest.
True.
Yeah.
You've got to view with the other.
And you always have your own preferences, you always have your own biases, you always take some kind of side, overtly or covertly. Of course, you as a scholar, you should try to achieve a certain degree of objectivity, or at least you should triangulate your sources and kind of leave space for multiple interpretations of events. That's what I think a scholar should do. On the other hand, you sometimes have to break the ice. And I think what Litwin Kapteins did with her book is she was trying to break the ice. Mm-hmm. And I think she deliberately also she took a stand, and she got herself into trouble. But I think it's like, if you will look at her book, like probably in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, you will be thankful and say, hey, that was an important book, and that actually started a new debate, which Somalis, I think, eventually have to have this kind of debate. What did we do to each other, and how do we deal with these people who killed each other? And do we want to forget about it? Do we want to kind of, like in some places, do we just kind of switch into a mode of amnesia, like just we don't care what happened in the past, we just are interested in the future? Or do we want to kind of establish some kind of memorials, or do we want to have in our school books also memories of that? I mean, in order to teach the next generation that these things should never happen again.
You're right, and especially in the last bit and I personally think that obviously to go actually further, to make everybody aware, to those who lost their parents, those who've seen the rape of their sisters and mothers, those who've been perhaps maybe kicked out, those who've been shelled and bombarded, those who've been basically wiped off the face of the earth because of their minority groups or whatnot. All of those people will not have accountability, and tomorrow they'll be telling these tales to their children, and it will be retold. And Somalis are very good at telling tales and passing that on. There might be a great chance of actually repeating the same thing again. Once the minority group, or those groups who were yesterday the victims, get the upper hand tomorrow. So for those sort of things not to happen, obviously there must be some sort of a dialogue where there is a recognition, where there is a well-versed conversation said, look, this happened, it's no kidding about our forefathers or our cousins or our uncles or our, we did this, and we should be very apologetic in terms of that this happened, and let's go on with it. No, Den Haag would not solve the issue for us, as the popular African motto goes with Uhuru, what he says, Hague is built for African leaders, which might be true, but they tend to be the ones that are mostly caught red-handed with their hand in the jar, because perhaps maybe don't know how to clean the actors. But yeah, that sort of recognition should be there, the dialogue should be there, and I totally agree with the work of clan cleansing that she's written, in terms of actually bringing about some sort of a dialogue, as you said, breaking the ice. But that wouldn't happen if we don't talk about it, if we don't bring the ugly truth outside. not for the purpose of claiming, not for the purpose of doing counterclaiming, not for the purpose of alienating or blaming a Somali sector or group of people, but actually to say, look, we need to talk about it. So as my final question, what would the future hold for Somalis and Somalia generally, especially with the federal state sort of mandate that we have, and knowing the Somali tribal mentalities and Somali clan mentalities that we have? Is that going to give I don't know, credible push for Somali way, or is that really the stuff that makes Somali non-Somali?
I think at the moment you have some degree of rebuilding in Mogadishu. I'm not sure if it's a durable change yet. You have still major problems in southern Somalia regarding security. We all know that Al-Shabaab is still around, and they hold considerable control in the hinterlands. And I mean, at the moment, Somalia and the south-central Somalia is still, I mean, in my perspective, it's still a theater of ongoing war. You still have more than 20,000 foreign troops in the country. The government couldn't really survive for very long without this external support. So I think this is a very sad situation still. There are some signs that things may change in the long run, but it is a very complicated situation still, and you don't really know how it's going to play out. In a beautiful world, I would say, Somalis really would find the strength to sit down together, speak openly about the different ideas and demands people have, justified demands also, like for instance Puntland saying, you know, I mean, if you want to have a proper federal regime, we also have to talk about resource sharing. It's not a way to go that you say, okay, we have a federal regime, but then still Mogadishu is kind of demanding, you know, the taxes from everywhere without giving anything back. So I mean, ideally, there would be the time and the energy to sit down and really slowly sort out these things, like bottom up and location by location, region by region. I think the process that led to this formation of Somaliland, I mean, not the declaration of independence on 18th of May 1991, but the whole long process which actually led to a peaceful and stable Somaliland, at least in the core area. This can be a lesson for Somalia, but as we all know, this took like for a couple of years, and it had its own setbacks. So Somaliland was not established in one day. It took basically 7 to 8 years for it to become stable, and then the diaspora started to invest, and then even the international community started to support some aspects of Somaliland. So I could imagine that a similar process would be very healthy for Somalia as a whole. But then you have to forget about all these foreign interventions, you have to forget about monopolizing power, you have to forget about all the arrogance which also the leaders in Mogadishu display, I think. You should really be moderate and say, okay, let's first things first. What we really need is peace in the area, and then we can think about development, and then we can think about, you know, resource exploitation and resource sharing, but not, you know, starting from top down again, and everything has to be organized within short time, following also an agenda which is still being set by the international community. I mean, also the whole idea that there have to be elections in Somalia, I think was it 2016? I mean, that's a completely crazy idea. What's this? Is it in the interest of Somalis? Is it in the interest of Somalis to hold elections, or is it in the interest of the European Union, America? I don't know who. I mean, why do people not just sit down and say, okay, we do it our own way? If you want to support us, support us. If not, please stay away. But this also demands political leaders who have a long-term vision and don't think about Chepkoda all the time. You know, don't think, okay, I have only a few years, I have to become rich now. So, but more like let's kind of be more modest and then try to achieve things like in a slower way, but maybe more sustainable way.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you.